Hello everybody. Today we have a video which I swear is not inflammatory on purpose. It just so happens that this particular phase and experiment that I'm going through in my training will likely tick some people off on the basis of the emotional attachment they have towards the movement pattern of hinging. Hinging is a vital thing to learn for lifters, for people who want to get bigger, for people who want to get stronger. I am not going to be attacking the efficacy of the hinge as a movement pattern to practice. I will simply be going over the reasons why some people do hinge and why I am choosing in this particular phase of my training not to hinge. Today we'll also be addressing whether or not you should and how you might go about that. So here in my notes I have some basic things to go over in terms of why people hinge for hypertrophy. People use hinging, things like deadlifts, stiff leg deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, and back extensions to target the muscles of the hamstrings, the glutes, the erectors, and the upper back, all based on the variation that you've chosen. People also do it because they have an emotional attachment to hinging as a movement pattern or as a practice. This is because they were taught often in their earlier stages of lifting that hinging is a vital thing that everyone should be doing. Again, I don't necessarily disagree. I just think that not evaluating this claim on a rational basis is a bit silly. Leaving it up to your emotions is less than ideal. The last reason why people hinge for hypertrophy is for carryover to competition-specific movements. Things like conventional or sumo deadlifts, axle bar deadlifts. Some people say they have carryover to Olympic lifts, all dependent on what you're training for in your competition-specific context. Now let's go over why people don't actually need to hinge in all programs, or at least hinge as their primary method of growing those muscles that we talked about earlier, the hamstrings, glutes, erectors, and upper back. Number one is many people actually got pretty astounding results doing either lower amounts of hinging or none at all. Tom Platz comes to mind. The only thing he did for his hamstrings as he became more advanced was leg curls. Understandably though, he is a genetic outlier, he's a drug user, but I think the principle of the matter still stands, as he was using a movement which has the most direct stimulus to the hamstrings with the lowest fatigue cost compared to stiff leg deadlifts, conventional deadlifts. That's his given reason for why he went about it that way. Also coming to mind, a video recently published by Elite FTS, Justin Harris, a recent interviewee on the Table Talk podcast, did a video for them and said that leg curling used to be one of the only things you did for hamstrings, and deadlift variations were less prized from a hypertrophy perspective for the hamstrings. And I think if you were to go around asking many lifters who are more experienced or lifted in the 2000s or even in the 90s, that would probably be a common theme if you ask them about hamstring training. Another reason why you might not need to make hinging a priority or a focus in your program is because it could potentially take away from your squatting volume. I personally am a person who cares much more about your ability to squat than your ability to hinge for my own personal training. So finding ways where I can squeeze in more leg volume at a lower fatigue cost often comes with needing to balance it with hinging volume. So by removing this or lowering its status in priority in the program, you're able to access more potential recovery to allocate towards your squat. The other thing about preferentially biasing your hamstring volume or all the muscles we talked about earlier, is that it kind of severely limits how much you can get away with. If you're doing like 8 sets of stiff leg deadlifts a week, it's going to fry your ability to get very productive additional volume. Basically, when you're using hinges as your primary movement for your hamstrings and you allocate most of your volume there, the recovery cost that incurs leaves it so that you can't generally exceed a volume of like between 8 and 12 sets. Now, that's perfectly fine. You can grow big hamstrings that way, but if you're in a context where you need bigger hamstrings or you need bigger erectors or even bigger glutes, but generally no, it's going to be more efficient to allocate more time to leg curls and to other movements to help you train your erectors. So to get to the experiment that I'm currently doing with my training, and it seems to be working very well, I have made hinging as a movement vestigial in the program, in the sense that it is performed in a limited capacity, not for the sake of bodybuilding, but for the sake of preserving my ability to do the movement. Instead, I am doing, with the additional volume that's been freed up by the reduction in hinging, barbell bent rowing for the upper back and the erectors, which also helps to continue to maintain the flexibility that comes from hinging, especially if you're doing something like a 25s barbell row or a 10s barbell row, and doing more leg curls for direct hamstring work, which allows me to get a lot more volume in, relatively speaking. Now, the reason why I'm actually doing this experiment is because I found that with the inclusion of the hinging, there was too much volume being directed towards my glutes, and I wanted to, seeing that there was an imbalance, or at least that there's a perceived imbalance in my physique, where my glutes are overdeveloped relative to my upper back, to my lower back, to my hamstrings. I wanted to correct that by using a more direct tonnage application through the barbell rows, through the leg curls. And I figured that this is a very good way to go about that without losing my ability to hinge. I also just think that barbell rows are very cool, and I want to do more of them. And I'm kind of just tired of things like stiff leg deadlifts or Romanian deadlifts taking up such a large portion of my program. Now, some people, as we discussed earlier, who have an emotional attachment to hinging or believe that it should be done in a more maximal capacity, will probably have a bad reaction to this methodology, which I'm planning to apply and have been applying now for the past 4 weeks to what I can say so far have been good results. These people are essentially irrational from a bodybuilding perspective. Why should I be doing a movement which limits my volume more, which doesn't allow me to target the muscles that I want in a more biased way, in a more preferential way? And why should I do a movement that I don't enjoy or that actively makes my sessions more difficult to get through? That isn't to say that I don't hinge because hinging is hard. It's more to say that hinging comes with a mental cost in the session, especially if you do it on top of something like heavy squats or even like lighter squats, but they're paused. It's a lot to deal with, and finding more pragmatic ways of divvying up the volume is preferable in this case. Some people will oppose this on the basis that you can actually never have too big of glutes. If you watched my hip thrust video, you'll know my opinions on that. I think that these shills for the glutes who believe it's like the most powerful or the most important muscle in the human body to develop are kind of mistaken as, yes, the glutes are important, but they are not the primary driver of most of our lifts. They are a secondary assistant. They are not a main focus of our physique. They are something which completes it or complements it, at least in the context of my own personal physique goals. So if you wanted to go about this methodology to minimize your hinging use in favor of getting a lot of the same benefits of hinging in a hypertrophy context, while being able to maintain it as a skill and still be able to get stronger on it, and eventually, when the time is right, phase back in more hinging. Say you wanted to do a deadlift specialization, you should be able to do that. But here's how you go about doing it. You would want to find a movement that allows you to directly target the muscles that you want to work preferentially, instead of relying on the diffused tonnage of the hinge. So typically that's going to be some kind of leg curl or some kind of alternative hinge, which is far more biased to one of the weaker portions. So if you had weaker spinal erectors and you wanted to bring them up, instead of doing a Romanian deadlift, you could do a 90-degree back extension. You could also do a leg curl for your hamstrings. For your upper back, you can do things like additional dumbbell rows. You can do bent over rows. Same thing for your erectors. More bent over rows doesn't go wrong. The key part, though, is keeping access to your flexibility and to your skill and neural capacity to hinge. You don't want to forget how to hinge because it's just a pain in the ass. So that's where I would really recommend using the bent over row, because the bent over row puts you in a position where you are forced to maintain a static hinge, and it's generally like a more stiff-legged hinge. So it should be very good in maintaining or helping to maintain your hamstring flexibility. And of course, I would recommend maintaining some kind of vestigial hinge, such as just 1 or 2 sets of stiff leg deadlifts once, maybe twice a week, generally for higher reps, not generally for lower reps. That should keep you mostly covered. So that's all I had for you guys today. Take care, train hard, and have a great day.